A very good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar today on India and international institutions post-COVID-19. Ananta Aspen Center is very happy to jointly host today's program with the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. We have partnered for 12 editions of the India-Singapore Strategic Dialogue, in addition to several conferences and symposia. This webinar is yet another platform to further strengthen our relationship. We are delighted to have two eminent foreign policy experts and friends of Ananta Aspen Center addressing the webinar today. They have been closely associated with the Center's Track 2 dialogues and other fora. Professor C Raja Mohan is Director, Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. He is a leading commentator on foreign policy and writes regular columns in leading newspapers. He's on the editorial boards of several Indian and international journals and has been associated with a number of think tanks in Delhi. He has also served on India's National Security Advisory Board. Ashok Malik is Policy Advisor at the Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India. Prior to his current role, he was the Press Secretary to the President of India and the first person from outside the civil services to be appointed to the post. Ashok has authored several research and policy papers for Indian and international institutions and publications. Professor Raja Mohan, may I now request you to start the discussions and please take over.
Much, Harshit. It's really good afternoon from Singapore. So we are 2.5 hours ahead of Delhi. So delighted to be here with you, with the Ananta Aspen Center. As you mentioned, ISAS and ISAS, the Institute of South Asian Studies, where I am in the National University of Singapore, and the Ananta Aspen Center have had a long set of collaborations. And now this technology, I think, allows us to break distance and do things in a way that, what we could not do before. So I hope there'll be a lot more events we can do in the future. It's also a special privilege, I think, to be with Ashok this afternoon on this event. It's really great to have him from the ministry to have this perspectives of how the government might be looking at some of these issues at hand. The subject, of course, what we have is today India and international institutions after the COVID-19 crisis. What we plan to have in the next hour or so, initially we'll have a conversation between Ashok and myself, and then we will move into question and answer session halfway through. But do send your questions in, somebody's collecting those, and we can have them transferred to me to be relayed to Ashok or for me to answer. So do start sending in the questions through the chat function. What I thought I'll do is really to begin with, 3 sets of context-setting remarks. One, I think, is the fact that we are today approaching nearly 200,000 deaths across the world. That is, soon it will be 250,000 people who have died from the corona crisis. Yet we're seeing how hard it is to get the world to cooperate and to do potentially a common fight. A lot of people talk about that we need to work together, but as we've seen, it's been rather difficult to get people working together. This is not new. We've seen this before in the case of climate change, which is one of the world's most important threats today. It's not been really possible to get everyone on the same page, and even when they came in, a lot of them have left. So I think the problem in all these global issues is one thing to say, because they're global, these challenges don't respect borders. But the problem is we are still organized in nation states. And we don't have a world government that can take a view of all issues in a comprehensive manner. So it is still a negotiation between governments in which questions of cost, questions of political interest, and a range of other things come in and make it hard to actually produce international cooperation. The second point I wanted to make was that the trouble with multilateral institutions, or the UN in particular, and a whole range of other institutions, that started well before the corona crisis. And the crisis has actually accentuated them. If you go back, we've been having trouble with the World Trading Organization for a long time. There's trouble in other regional institutions. So for example, the East Asia Summit, not everybody agrees on everything. So, and the Permanent Court of Arbitration, for example, passed a judgment on South China Sea, but it was not acceptable to the Chinese. So we have a problem of harmonizing interests, and this harmonizing has become even more difficult given the renewed contestation between the great powers and the tensions between the major powers is making it even harder to actually go forward on international cooperation. That brings me to the third set of issues which I wanted to highlight. While the response of the G20 has not been great, the UNSC, it could not even be convened through the month of March because one major power, China, felt that it's not really a matter of peace and security. And there are other major powers supporting China. So therefore, even just convening a meeting was hard. It's only when China stepped down as the chairman of the Security Council for that month in March. In April, we've had the first meeting, but meeting is one thing, but producing anything concrete was quite difficult, and we saw nothing much came out of that. Far more challenging, I think, looking forward, is really the one organization that we need most today to deal with the corona crisis is the World Health Organization. But it is this very organization today in the center of controversy, where a lot of people, especially the US and the Trump administration, have accused it of being too deferential to China, of keeping the rest of the world dark about the nature and the severity of the crisis, which in turn made it harder for the rest of the world to actually take measures well in advance, and that had created a set of problems. Of course, China rejects this charge. Dr. Tedros, who is the Secretary General of the WHO, does not agree with this assessment. He thinks they've done very well. But India itself, I mean, was keeping its counsel rather than going by the WHO guidelines. For example, WHO was saying, don't do travel restrictions. But India chose quite early on to say, look, we need to do travel restrictions if we want to protect India from the emergence of the virus into the country. So most countries then have done actions on their own, while the argument on WHO continues. So we've had Trump suspend the funding. There is talk about an alternative institution. So we are really in the middle of a major crisis, and the WHO crisis actually is a broader crisis of international institutions at a time of renewed great power rivalry and contestation. So where does India stand in this? I mean, that might be something Ashok would want to pick up on and speak for the next few minutes. Ashok, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Raja. Thank you, Harshit. Thank you, Aspen, for organizing this. Good morning to you from India, and good afternoon to you, Raja, and other friends joining from the east of India. You raised a whole host of very interesting and relevant issues, Raja. The multilateral system was under some pressure even before this for a whole host of reasons. As you very correctly say, this has accentuated it. If you look at trade, for instance, WTO was going through a midlife crisis in its roughly in its 20th or 25th year. And this has knocked it down even further because the economic implications of the COVID-19 pandemic still remain to be played out, but certainly they will have an impact on global trade, global supply chains, and people will look inward or closer home for trade. So WTO, for instance, is clearly going to suffer a shock. More broadly, the multilateral system, WTO of course came up in the 1990s, but its predecessor GATT and the entire UN system, including WHO, the Security Council and so on, came up in the late 1940s at the end of the Second World War. India has been arguing, as have many other countries for several years, that these institutions have to become 21st century compatible. We made that argument most strongly in terms of the membership of the Security Council, and for making a case for India's claim for a place on the membership of the Security Council. But that's not the only aspect of making the multilateral system 21st century compatible. if you look at WHO, for instance, there will certainly be a postmortem. WHO insiders and leaders would want it themselves. To what degree are they ready for pandemics of this nature? To what degree are they ready for zoonotic diseases, which are going to come over and over again? This is certainly not the last one, given the nature of ecological and environmental damage that urbanization and development have caused. When WHO was set up in the late 1940s, it was about 100 years after the great cholera epidemics of the 19th century. It was 3 decades after the Spanish flu. The world had actually forgotten those big transcontinental pandemics. SARS was an early indicator, and Ebola to some degree, but they were checked. And WHO did take some steps in terms of the international health regulations, in terms of reporting standards that they gave member countries. Standards that could not be enforced and actually depended on good global citizen behavior from those countries. Good global citizen behavior has not always been established. Just in this case, there have been questions raised in the case of COVID. So how does WHO and how does international health governance move forward and make itself ready for an environment that is very different from what it was when it was established in the 1940s or even from 10 years ago? So we don't believe WHO does not have a role. It certainly, to use the Prime Minister's words at the G20 summit, WHO needs strengthening, it needs reform, it needs both. Because while multilateral institutions will be weakened and have been weakened after this, it's not that there's no need for them. And WHO certainly has a very important role in a whole range of countries, including in India. But while it needs resources, while it needs to be restructured, it will also have to internally look at its own systems. If you look at the whole notion of, you mentioned the UN Security Council not discussing the COVID-19 crisis. The whole notion of security in the 1940s was essentially military security and maintaining military peace in Europe and Asia, and maybe to some degree Africa. That has changed. The threat of a military conflict across continents is very low and is not pronounced. But issues like cybersecurity, which of course have been discussed in the past, or global health security, pandemic security and preparedness, these are today's security concerns. Yet you find that the UN Security Council cannot or does not want to consider them, or some countries say that these are not conventional security issues, which again leads you to believe that are these notions and these norms 21st century compatible. The third set of issues I'd like to turn to is governance of these global institutions. Whether they are weaker or less salient than they were 10 years ago or more salient is besides the point. Some will be more salient, some will be less salient. But issues of global governance, issues of their accountability, issues of efficiency of spending within these institutions have to be revisited. How political have they become? How politicized have they become? What degree of autonomy have they got? Have they got autonomy in the right areas? Which is, they've got autonomy in certain areas, in say financial areas, but have they got sufficient autonomy in professional areas, which is different? I think partly this has to do with the way democracies have approached elections to leadership positions of these bodies. The West has gradually over the years lost interest. The US is a prime example. It periodically gets interested, but then forgets it. It has not approached it strategically. India and countries of our type have approached it from frankly, from a historical legacy position that, these were our positions 30 years ago in a post-colonial era, perhaps, and we will make choices in accordance with those legacies. I think the time, if we are looking at institutions that are to be 21st century compatible, we have to look at human resources of these institutions and leadership positions of these institutions, and the approach to choosing the leadership of these institutions, including through elections, in a manner that is more pragmatic and also more 21st century compatible. So I think you will see more coordination and more strategic thinking on that front as well. Other countries have been thinking strategically, but I don't think our sister democracies have been till very recently. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Those comments. I think you talked about two very important dimensions. I think one was how the nature of the challenges have increased and the traditional definitions have evolved. Yet the international system is finding it very hard to deliver on those because of the huge structural constraints. And it is not just the agenda that has changed, it's also the fact that multilateral institutions have evolved over a period of time, and what was designed by the allies of the Second World War to deal with the new world that emerged out of the Second World War. But very quickly, US and the Soviet Union fell apart, and the UN system was largely dysfunctional. And that's why you had parallel multilateralisms. You had the NATO for the West, you had the Warsaw Pact, you had the what was called the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, IMF, and collaboration among them. And then you had the Comecon in the socialist world. It's only when the Cold War ended that we saw an attempt to bring everyone together. And it seemed to work because China's own reforms, Russia's, the post-Soviet Russia seemed more open to collaboration. But the integration of these two powers into the old institutions has proved difficult. And the 90s, but created a sense that we can really now do everything. All we need is to develop new norms. But within a decade or more or less, the major powers started falling apart. Russia was no longer willing to be silent in the Security Council. China was asserting its own interests, and as you said, has been thinking very strategically about these issues. So therefore, just as the integration of Russia into the European institutions proved hard, the integration of China into the WTO has produced a whole range of challenges for the West. And now the augmentation between them is fundamentally threatening the stability of the entire structure that seemed so well placed at the beginning of the 1990s. So the return of the great power rivalries, the return of competitive multilateralism. But within that, the second point you mentioned was that about India thinking more practically and more strategically about multilateral institutions. If I may just step back and look at India's own evolution in the multilateral arena. Go back to the 50s, I mean, India was very idealist, took the Kashmir question to the UN Security Council, gave away the Security Council seat. I mean, we don't know how credible those interest in having India as a permanent member. India was not interested. And India was also taking big initiatives on nuclear disarmament, on decolonization, on arms control. So India was active and very idealist in the 50s and the early 60s. And then in the 70s, we saw India move into a very anti-Western, radicalized demand for sweeping global reforms. But the delivery of those reforms was limited because of very nature of the international system. And that phase lasted about 2 decades. And after 1990, India went into a very defensive crouch, afraid of the UN intervention in Kashmir, afraid of somebody taking away your nuclear weapons, afraid of the non-proliferation regime. So we went into this inward, a defensive fending off the world, even as we reformed, rebuilt our relationship with the major powers. It seemed that the defensiveness was carrying on too far, even when India came out of its weaknesses. Today, India is a larger nation, is a bigger economy, and is in a better position to deal with the world. So the defensiveness seemed to continue, whether it's WTO, whether it is the UN, whether it is most multilateral institutions. But the first signs of change were really in the climate change debate, when the Modi government came in and changed India from saying no to everything to one of saying, no, we are going to be part of the solution. We're going to take the initiative like Solar Alliance. We're going to find a new coalition to be able to deal with the climate change, which is a real threat for India as much as it is for the world. So that shift was an important one, from a defensive, naysaying, large country to one which is willing to take more responsibility today. That I think is an important shift, but we still haven't seen this fully reflect in the way we articulate ourselves in the UN. But at least some areas we've seen some interesting change in the recent years. For example, in the WIPO election, India seemed to support a Singapore candidate against a Chinese candidate, which is kind of unthinkable, say 20 years ago. But of course, the Singapore candidate won against the Chinese candidate because there was a larger coalition backing him. So that is one important, in a sense, we're looking at things practically rather than merely a predetermined, predefined positions. It's almost like a robot that you press the button, multilateral solution. I mean, we were really jumping on one side. So that is one interesting change. The second, I think, compulsion, I would say, when you can reflect on this, there was a time in the early 90s, we joined BRIC, RIC, etc., fearing America would be the threat to India's core security interests, for example, on Kashmir and on the nuclear issue. And on terrorism, there was not enough support from the West. So we joined the so-called, the strategic triangle with a specific focus on multilateral cooperation. In fact, the argument was, even if we have differences on the boundary, we have common interests in the multilateral domain, therefore we must work with China in the multilateral domain. But the last few years, we've seen China block us on the nuclear supplies group. China prevent us from putting pressure on Pakistan on the terrorism question, and China taking Kashmir question to the Security Council. While it is the US, France, and a few Western countries that are actually supporting India. So this is a very different world out there, where our presumed friends have turned hostile, and the presumed adversaries actually have become our partners in securing India's interests. So is there enough appreciation of this in our system? And lastly, in the WHO itself, I mean, I think we've seen in the past where India actually voted for Mr. Tedros, voted with a G77 candidate. Today, of course, India is quiet, but as you said, we need to look at these reforms emerging in the future. There are also new experimentation that India is doing with new coalitions like the Quad Plus. We've seen last few weeks the Foreign Secretary in consultation with the US, Japan, Australia, South Korea, New Zealand, and Australia. So is this a long-term trend where we develop ad hoc coalitions to deal with our interests rather than just stick to what we know, or we are willing to experiment a lot more in the days? And finally, that India was criticized and praised for abandoning the non-aligned movement. Some liked it, some said this is terrible. But I think what is interesting, the Modi government today, the Foreign Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, certainly talks about India as a southern power, that India is going to work with its friends and partners in the developing world. We've seen some of that in the COVID crisis of India's engagement with the countries of the global south. That again seems an interesting way that it's not south versus north, that we have stake in the south, we're going to work with some countries in the north, and that finally this is about interest-based multilateralism rather than an ideological multilateralism of the kind that we've seen before.
I think you put it quite well. It is interest-based rather than ideological. There are elements of legacy thinking which come up just off and on. I'm not denying that. But the automaticity of voting for a G77 candidate in an election simply because he or she is a G77 candidate, I think that thinking has declined. I'm not suggesting we will not vote for a candidate from the G77. If the candidate is good enough and suits our interests, of course we will. We're not sort of never going to vote for such a person, but there is no automaticity the way there may have been some years ago. Also, you see, we do have very strong equities with the global south. We are a role model for many countries that came out of the colonial experience or the decolonization experience in the 40s and 50s or 50s and 60s. We are important for them as a role model, as a democracy that has broadly delivered on many human development goals and honest economy, as a knowledge partner, a partner that shares its learnings and its experiences. We have a lot of equity. We should not mock that or discount that. This serves us well. This serves us well in international elections. It serves us well when we stand for election for the UN Security Council. It stands us in very good stead when we take on a country like Britain and defeat it at the International Court of Justice. And that is because of our equities with the Global South. So we are certainly a model Southern power, and that is our strength. We can never sort of claim to be a purely global Northern power. But what has broadly happened is that 1990 was an inflection point in global history. It was the end of the Cold War, and the following year, of course, economic reforms began in India. The logic of 1990-91 has run its course to some degree. One, in 1990, and perhaps in the first Clinton term or the last years of the senior Bush term, but certainly in the first Clinton term, it was the unipolar moment. It was America as the hyperpower, America unchallenged, and there were concerns in many countries, including in India. And of course, we went through a very difficult time in Kashmir, and America was not to help at that point. So there were concerns. There were concerns about the American position vis-a-vis the world and vis-a-vis us. There was also economic reform, and then leading on to the creation of WTO and the whole globalization process, of which we were beneficiaries, substantial beneficiaries. The Chinese perhaps were greater beneficiaries, and maybe they just played the system better. 20 years on, the American unipolar movement seems far behind us, and we have much more to do with the Americans, much more in common with the Americans, which many of us instinctively knew. We are both open democratic societies, and we obviously have shared interest. So we recognize that we have more to do with them and with many countries of the West on multilateral issues, on global goods and services, on terrorism, on the global commons, and frankly, even on climate change, where we have worked with the Obama administration, and we are still working with many American states. Second, the whole logic of the reforms of 1991 and of the economic globalization process has suffered some setback. Globalization has suffered three big knocks. One was, of course, 9/11, which also used the tools of globalization to inflict disaster. Then 2008, the financial crisis. And this COVID experience has perhaps crippled it. So the idea that you can tell your domestic constituency and your people at home that I need not manufacture or secure supplies that are important. Because if there is a shortfall in my domestic system, the market will automatically and miraculously fill the gap by going to the lowest cost producer who may be somewhere in another continent, maybe in the inner recesses of China. That logic has suffered a crippling blow. And it will lead to, I wouldn't want to call it sort of reshoring, I would want to call it safe shoring. It would, in the case of health security, it would lead to some reliance on a restructured and reformed WHO. But it would also lead to countries doing individual or bilateral or plurilateral deals and arrangements. So just as in 1945, or in the period between 45 and 55 perhaps, the security of the West was contingent upon a Security Council, but also a NATO. You will have similar arrangements here as well. You will have the multilateral institutions. There will be an important role for them, especially in areas like health security. But you will also look at smaller arrangements, or more nimble arrangements, where you will sort of turn to each other for and have interest in each other's capacities. So the dialogue of the Indo-Pacific group, the Quad Plus, as you call it, is one example. Certainly, it's very interesting that the Quad itself was a crystallization of the first responder group that came up after the Asian tsunami of December 2004. The four democracies that came together as the core group for first response and relief. And this, in many respects, this crisis has done to health security and pandemics what, or can do to health security and pandemics what the tsunami did to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, which has been such a facet of Indian diplomacy in the past 15 odd years. And I certainly can see new partnerships and groups or platforms evolving. And what you call the Quad Plus is certainly one of them.
Thank you, Ashok. I think there's a lot, I think that's already emerged in the discussion. One, how the 1990s, as you said, has run its course. There's a new world out there. The nature of the great power rivalry has changed. The actors have changed. And this is having a powerful impact on multilateral institutions. And India itself has a lot more capabilities today than in the past. And India is looking at multiple formats of, multilateralism, if you will, whether it is Quad Plus on the one side, BRICS, then you have the Indian Ocean groupings. So it is a way, again, a practical, interest-based engagement with the multilateral institutions. And the recognition also, I believe, that in the end, the multilateral institutions are both about power as well as about principle. Power because multilateral institutions reflect the distribution of power in the international system, but they're also a vehicle for generating new norms and creating new rules for the world to live by. And where it's not possible to do it collectively in the UN-related organizations, you also work with others in other institutions to be able to push those norms. So there's quite a bit here to chew on. We have a clear 25 minutes for question and answers from our audience. So please start rolling your questions in, and I'll be happy to start the whole set of issues on how do we, think about India's multilateralism in the coming days. So I have the first set of questions here. One is on the global institutions are partial and ineffective, and with the P5 divided, is it really possible to reform them? So you think we must keep focusing on like UN Security Council structure? I mean, or do we focus on the reform, or do we say do practical cooperation where possible, rather than get stuck on the form of the international institutions?
I think you keep hammering away at the form debate at one level, but that's what you say, and what you actually do is the practical stuff, where the practical smaller alliances and arrangements. I think India will contribute in a big way to the debate about a reform of the whole multilateral system when it hopefully goes Security Council on January 1st next year, where we are preparing to put the full weight of our sort of diplomatic experience, our developmental experience, and our sort of intellectual weight, as it were, towards pushing that reform process. India has been talking about UN reform for some time. It hasn't always had takers. But I think this crisis and the economic and social implications of this crisis, because do remember, issues like food security, issues like hunger, issues like poverty, or reduction or elimination of absolute poverty, these were taken for granted, that they've either been achieved or will be achieved very shortly with the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals, not just in India, but globally. To what degree the COVID-19 crisis will reopen those chapters which we thought had been closed globally, we don't know. And that will make people wonder whether the current multilateral institutional system as it exists can deal with crises that have come back. So I think if you ask any power in the world, does the system need reform? 15 years ago, they may have said yes, no, shrugged their shoulders. I don't think you'll meet anyone today, perhaps including in Beijing, who will say, no, it doesn't need reform. Now, the the course of the reform, the nuts and bolts of the reform, of course, remain to be seen. But I cannot see India, not benefiting from the reform or not having a bigger role in the multilateral institutional framework after the reform. And more important, I can't see India not playing a major role in actually bringing about that reform, because the world is turning to us for ideas. The Indian model of reform and development within a democratic, transparent political system has more salience today. So, 10 years ago, when we were both writing in the media, or 15 years ago, people spoke about the Delhi model and the Beijing model. And many spoke about the Beijing model approvingly. It has its benefits, of course. It's done miraculous work in lifting people out of poverty and in building great cities and the economic miracle that is China. But people will be less sanguine, to use a word, or lazily satisfied with the Beijing model today, especially after the shortcomings of that system have come to the fore, whether it is in tracking and reporting what happened in Wuhan. Of course, I don't want to anticipate that debate, but people will start wondering, or even the nature of assistance to other countries, including European countries, or the nature of the diplomacy that has followed, public diplomacy that has followed. People are asking questions, and so there is a search for new answers. I think there's also a greater willingness to listen to India.
That's the two questions that have come up, and I think, you mentioned, look, the 1990s globalization has come to an end. So one question was about globalization. Is really the current impact a deep and lasting one? Second, more, both domestically as well, the complement of globalization, which is the neoliberal economics of deregulation, liberalization, and larger role for market. Now, we've seen these forces now taking a beating, given the fact we saw most countries shut down their borders. The first thing, we were talking about a borderless world just a few years ago, and now the first response is everyone secures their own borders, stops travel across borders. We've also seen in the Western world, countries moving towards, against long supply chains of the type you globally disperse production. Today you mentioned it, that we need shorter supply chains, more resilient supply chains, and not just economic efficiency. We've also seen the big government come back in a very impressive way, that when there is a crisis of this kind, the governments have to take a lot more responsibility. Even in the most free enterprise society like the US, today the government is writing what is called a paycheck protection program. I mean, just people, and Britain too, just paying people money just to stay where they are, and not when they're not doing any work because of the crisis. So big government, restoring control over borders, the shorter supply chains, and taking a more balanced view of economics, politics, and society, rather than the pure economic efficiency argument that dominated for the last 25, 30 years.
Again, Raja, you're absolutely right. Now, if you look at the US as an example, the US is the sort of the grandfather, the godfather of globalization, in a sense, or of free trade. But every US election since 2000, since Bush versus Gore, where Gore actually got more votes, as you know, and lost very narrowly. Every election since 2000, with the exception of 2004, which was a wartime election, had a different dynamic and different set of issues. But every election from 2000 to Mr. Trump's election 4 years ago has had a very strong constituency against free trade, against globalization, against the hollowing out of American jobs, and has seen a revolt by blue-collar workers in the American heartland. The former steel worker, the former manufacturing worker, and so on. That worker has voted for Obama in one election, he's voted for Trump in the next election. He's been searching for answers, he or she. But the anger has been the same. And in the last election, Sanders, who came from the left, Trump from the right, Hillary somewhere in the middle, all three actually promise to walk away from TPP. So all three had the same position on a big sort of pillar of global trade and global supply chains. I think to some degree, the old right-left definitions no longer hold, because you have politicians in, say, America or the West, or who are from the right, who have strong nationalist and identity positions, but whose voters also look to them to secure domestic political, economic interests, protect jobs at home, and if that requires even shutting borders to foreign goods or service providers, even that is acceptable. So it's a hybrid sort of traditional right and left. It's the old right and left definitions no longer hold. To some degree, Trump is the most anti-trade or trade suspicious Republican president in history. But he's there. I mean, you can't deny it. That is reality. The resurgence of nationalism and nation-first positions and deeply felt identities as a response to perhaps the overreach of globalization or the discontent that globalization has spawned in some communities is also a factor. And one can't sort of wish that away. All of these will play their role and will be accentuated, again, to use your words, after COVID-19. The pressure on very long transoceanic supply chains is coming not just from domestic workers who are worried about hollowing out local manufacturing. It's also coming from those who are worried about climate change, because there is an economic cost to importing, pencils or pens that cost maybe 1 cent from the middle of China to the middle of to the Midwest. There is an economic cost, of course, because that pen may cost 1 cent in China, it may cost 15 cents if it was made in Wisconsin. But there's also an ecological cost. What does it mean in terms of climate change? What does it mean in terms of marine life being disrupted by sort of big ocean liners that carry cargo? And there are already funds which are promoting regional and closer home trade, precisely because of an ecological or climate change imperative. And this was happening before COVID as well. I think
grow local, eat local, grow local. I mean, in many places.
Or perhaps regional. I mean, if not completely local, perhaps regional. Though there will be some sort of impulses which will say go absolutely local as well. So all of this is going to be with us for some time to come. One can't wish it away. If you look at migrant workers across our country, more than going back to their factories and working, they first want to go home. They want to be with their families. And one can completely understand that. Yeah. So that instinct is a human instinct, and it's going to be with us for some time.
I think what you said about, the kind of two of us, for example, we've traveled a lot. I mean, when we were in think tanks, we constantly go for seminars. But there's already a backlash, even before COVID crisis, saying, look, flying shame, is it really necessary? And probably with the Zoom and other new technology software, the pressure to engage people with less impact on environment, it's quite clearly is going to be an important imperative. But one of the interesting questions that came up was really, how is China's performance in international multilateral institutions has been? My own view is that, look, there was a period when China was not part of the multilateral institutions because PRC, the People's Republic, was not recognized by the West. It had to sit outside. Taiwan was representing China inside. And India at the time had quite a expansive role in the multilateral institutions, whether it was in the World Bank and other financial institutions, in the UN, GATT, ADB. There is, at least my sense, the privileged position that we've had at the time. I mean, some of it was probably squandered by the kind of choices we made on a whole range of issues. But it's not to do post-mortem, but to see what do we learn from that experience where we started out quite in an advantageous position, but we could not fully leverage our position within the international institutions. China, on the other hand, was a late entrant, really joined the UN in the late 70s, and was tentatively finding its way in the 80s. But today, it's systematically sought to extend its influence, systematically raise its capabilities. And I think it goes to the credit of the Chinese. They've invested in engaging the multilateral institution. They've created the domestic capability to be able to participate in multilateral negotiations. So there's much India can learn from China in terms of, if we want a credible, effective multilateral policy, then we really need to make those investments. For example, one was on law. I mean, the Chinese, the communist states were not supposed to believe in bourgeois law at one point. But if you see the Chinese performance in the last 30 years, they've invested huge amounts in mastering the Western discourse on international law, on international norms, and at the same time, develop their own ideas in terms of what their interests were, and to be able to project those onto the multilateral institutions. So Chinese benefited from participation as well as push their own agenda in these institutions. And finally, they're also creating alternative institutions. For example, today, the Belt and Road Initiative is the single biggest financial initiative outside the Bretton Woods institutions. So that tells you something. Take advantage of what you have, but also build your own. So these two are not contradictory, that you can have both, and that you must invest in the existing multilateral institutions. You must also build your own coalitions, your own groups. So there is actually, as Mao Zedong would have said, you walk on two legs, on what already is there and build your own institutions. So I think there is a lot I think India must learn by studying Chinese experience, where they've actually late entrant who have transformed their own participation as well as taken advantage. I think maybe they're overreaching today, but until now, it's been a fantastic performance in the multilateral institutions.
Look, there's absolutely no question that China's strategic use of its growing and very impressive economic might has much to teach us and much to teach any country. And the Chinese started thinking like a great power even before they became a great power. They prepared for power in a sense. Yes, there may have been overreach here and there, I'm not denying that. But the fact is, even after COVID, the world will still see more China than it did, say, 10 years ago. Okay? That you cannot wish that away. This is not a zero-sum game. You will have to live with the China that is a very important participant in global debates, very important stakeholder in the global economy, and in global politics, and in global institutions. In terms of China building its own institutions, so there are questions about the viability of the Belt and Road Initiative. We all know that. And there are questions about transparency norms and financial institutions in China. So that's all well taken. But yes, they have gone about building their own institutions as well. India has also got into that to some degree with the International Solar Alliance, for instance, with the Coalition for Disaster Relief, Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, which has actually logically flowed out from its experiences with the Gujarat earthquake in 2001 and the tsunami that followed straight after. So building HADR in the broader sense of the term as a global diplomatic instrument and an instrument of net security provision in the world. I think COVID will lead to more such institutions. In fact, in the Indo-Pacific sort of expanse, and of course it extends from, depending on how you see it, it extends from Sydney to Somalia, or maybe San Francisco to Somalia. In the Indo-Pacific expanse, you are far from finished with institution building and platform creation. In fact, I think the next 2 or 3 years, you may see another sort of alphabet soup emerging, many of which will have India. I don't think you'll have the same members in all groups or all platforms, depending on, of course, some could be economic, some could be supply chain related, some could be pandemic and health security related, which will also have trade implications, because if you do want to secure each other's health, then you also need to secure each other's sort of health supplies, and that has a trade implication, for instance. Of course, I'm anticipating what may happen. So, but I think you will see a lot more of institution building in the coming few years in the Indo-Pacific area in particular, with India playing a lead role, playing an important role.
I think we're beginning to now run into time. There were two broad themes that came up. I mean, I think one was the 1990s drawing to a close, the big government coming in. So some of the questions pointed, look, does it mean, a profound change in the way we politically govern ourselves? Does it mean an end to the world as we've known? There, I would want to say, look, there was a world before 79. I mean, that the US was a democracy, but it was not promoting liberalization the way it is, or the way it was promoting financial services. So I think if 79-80 was a marker with Reagan-Thatcher model of liberalization at home, deregulation, and pushing for expansive globalization, that phase is what has run its course. So this is not going to change the fundamentals of all these societies. But what we are going to see is how do societies, how do governments relate to their own poor because of the inequities that have emerged. And the other is the interrelationships, that the idea that you could completely outsource production and in-source labor, that unlimited, uninhibited globalization is what is going to be checked, and that we're not at the end of that, that there will still be intercourse, there will still be international cooperation, there will still be cross-border flows. The challenge is to find that, shall we say, like Goldilocks, that right combination about how much of a big government, how much of globalization, and it is a rearrangement. Each society is going to do it in its own way, rather than simply abandoning what we've been doing. So it is a fresh look at the challenges that exist, a fresh look domestically in terms of how we relate to our societal needs, and externally, how does each society relate to another society, and that must be based on mutual benefit, and that it can't be just one side benefits in relation to the others. So much of the rearrangements that are going on today are about really restructuring, but not abandoning completely what we've known and what has given us so much progress in the last 30 years. Ashok.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you, Raja. Because multilateral institutions have taken a bit of a knock and maybe made themselves a little less relevant, and hopefully they can recover in years to come. Because that has happened, it does not mean we are less international or we need the world less. We may not need certain institutions as much as we did 20 years ago, but we need other countries, we need partner countries, we need coalitions of the willing in various areas. Could be peace and security, could be could be technology, which is another we haven't discussed. It's a huge domain, and this whole business about technology will get even more accentuated post-COVID. Especially technology platform choices that you make. And as you know, the ministry has a new division on emerging technologies. And that's simply because technology choices are no longer just technical choices. They are, in a sense, strategic choices. So you will need the world, you will need partner countries, you will need partner arrangements, platforms, alliances, call it what you will, groupings, plurilateral groupings perhaps. But no country can afford to sort of shut its doors and say we will be completely sealed. That era is gone. But the multilateral system, as we've known it for the past 70 odd years, already under some pressure, now needs a serious look. It needs a serious relook because, in some senses, people are calling this the biggest event since the Second World War. The First World War ended and the League of Nations came about. Second World War led to the UN system. No one's suggesting a third incarnation, but the second incarnation has to have a reboot. I think that's important.
You mentioned technology. Actually, there was a question on technology. I think we almost running out of time. But just a thought, that new division, in fact, you mentioned technology division, that the question was really about the world, the digitalization of the world economy. and even digitalization of health. Today, what we're seeing is really health is really turning out to be a data business. That it's really one of bringing technology to deal with health in a very interesting, whether it's in tracking, individual patients or those who are spreading it, or in finding new solutions. So technology has become critical, and I think you mentioned the integration of this into our larger strategy is of course challenging, but I think at least the ministry has started the process.
You see, if you look at the way we've tackled the COVID-19 crisis, and touch wood, so far we've managed it fairly well, whether it is in getting money across to the poorer sections of Indian society who need the money, or whether it is in contact tracing, which has been done the old-fashioned, laborious way with people going from house to house, and they've done a fantastic job, or through mechanisms like the Arogya Setu app and geotagging, which is using technology, or in the use of big data for modeling. Our familiarity with digital technology has proved a boom and a force multiplier. 30 years ago, we would have had a much bigger crisis in the absence of that. So in a sense, the faith of India and of, frankly, the Prime Minister in technology to meet not just economic goals, but social sector goals has been reinforced and validated. It's surprising. Telemedicine is something we in India have been talking about for years. We've spoken about it in terms of our relationship with Africa. We've spoken about it in terms of diagnosing diseases or illnesses in villages. America has woken up to telemedicine with the COVID crisis. In fact, they haven't used the term telemedicine. They've said diagnosis over mobile phones, which is telemedicine. We've been saying it for years and years, but the world is waking up to it, and there's so much more we can offer there in terms of how to use these technologies. So yes, it's an exciting world, a brave new world, to use Huxley's term, but let's see what it leads to. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ashok. I think we're really running out of time. I just want to bring this to a close, saying that we've really covered a lot of ground. I think we looked at the impact of the current crisis, which is on the existing global institutions, and how the stress test, as some people are calling, on international institutions has just begun. So this story is going to be there with us, and how the international system can rearrange itself, which Ashok talked at length about, is going to be one important thing. The second thing we talked about was really how India's own approach to multilateral institutions is beginning to change. Ashok touched upon some of the potential changes that are beginning to unfold, but I think is a space that anybody who's following India's foreign policy, India's relations with the rest of the world, must carefully follow, because we are seeing, I think, what could be a consequential role for India in a rearranged system globally, where India takes a more leadership, more activist role, and a more practical role to build something different than what we have at this point. And finally, the whole question of that the structural change that is unfolding today, the end of globalization, the emergence of new forces, how India can take advantage of those for its own internal transformation. So we are at a cusp of something big. The COVID crisis is going to make us take a fresh look at the way we organize ourselves at home and our relationship with other societies, and how do we rebalance the need to build a stronger society at home while making India more effective externally. So I will stop here by thanking Ashok again, and thanking the Ananta Aspen Center and the Institute of South Asian Studies, my institute, for organizing together, and for all of you for being with us for the last 1 hour. Thank you, and have a good day.
Thank you, Raja. Thank you, Harshit. Thank you, Ananta Aspen Center, and thank you to NUS. Thank you so much.